of police violence against people of African descent, and Elsie Saina, also a lawyer, advocate of the High Court of Kenya, and the acting Deputy Executive Director of the Kenyan section of the International Commission of Jurists. So I think you'll all agree we are going to have an amazing debate with this panel of experts. But first of all, just a couple of housekeeping notes. It's virtual, of course, because of the pandemic. This debate is being live streamed on Facebook, and it's being recorded as well. So quotes, facts, questions that come up may be shared on social media. A reminder again, you have the interpretation if you need it. Now to our structure. Our idea is not just to outline a problem and to complain. We want to look at solutions, best practices, possible legal remedies. That means, of course, that you and our online audience can also participate. After our first couple of questions and answers to our panelists, we'll be inviting you to make comments, ask questions. You can do them via Zoom in the chat or via Facebook. Now, to my panelists, all of you in different places, all far away from me, but I assume you're all ready to go. I'm going to ask each of you a question, which I hope will help to bring in your own specific areas of expertise. And I'm going to start with you, Niels Meltzer, it being, so to speak, your field of expertise, torture. Why, in your opinion, is it important to address police methods, policing in this context?
Thank you very much, Imogen, and thank you very much to the OMCT and all organizers and partners for having me on this important event. To me, police violence has been a topic for my mandate from the outset. In fact, my first report to the General Assembly of the United Nations was on the topic of extracustodial use of force and how that's relevant for the prohibition of torture and ill treatment. And so here, obviously, I'll not do a long presentation, and my understanding is we'll have a very interactive discussion. So just to say that to me, it was important to stress that torture and ill treatment, although traditionally analyzed mainly in the custodial, in a context in terms of detained persons deprived of their liberty, where torture and ill treatment obviously is a big issue, that does not mean that it's limited to those contexts. So that the prohibition of torture and ill treatment very much applies also outside this custodial context. And that's precisely where the use of force by police, law enforcement agents, border guards, and so on becomes very relevant in practice. One closing remark on this particular point is that this issue of use of force by law enforcement traditionally has been analyzed very much from a perspective to the right to life. But that is very appropriate where that use of force is of a lethal nature, where it puts life in danger. But a lot of use of force, harassment, sexual abuse, intimidation, and physical violence even is committed without necessarily causing a risk to life. And there, the analysis under the right to life is obviously not adequate. And it was very important to me to stress that the appropriate framework to analyze this question really there is the prohibition of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, or in extreme cases, even torture. And I can speak more to the definition and so on and how it applies precisely later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Niels. Just a reminder to our panelists, you are free to put your hand up like this. I will see you if there's a particular point you want to come in on. But for now, Rahini, can I bring you in, please, here? Do you go along with what Niels had said, that there's perhaps too narrow a definition here about right to life, and that there are other parts of police behavior which we need to be looking at more closely?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Niels, for saying that. I think the way I've traditionally looked at it, I work on behalf of Physicians for Human Rights on crowd control policing, is looking at freedom of assembly and freedom of expression as well. And what we really focus on is that the use of extra custodial use of force, especially when it comes to crowd control or protests, demonstrations, is really via the use of these crowd control weapons or less lethal weapons. And those really prevent people, the individuals who are attacked obviously have a use of force, but all of the individuals in the crowd also have these violations of freedom of assembly and freedom of speech, because that's inevitably what these indiscriminate weapons cause.
That sounds to me like a point to bring in Michael Hamilton, because we have seen also, I think we have to be honest, over the last year, a more obvious use of crowd control justified by the desire to stop the spread of the virus, the pandemic. Nevertheless, are we seeing too many inroads into the right to freedom of association?
Thank you, Imogen. Well, I mean, I think you're right. I think the last year has certainly brought to many people's attention the kind of policing that there is. And obviously, as you say, that has been justified on public health grounds in many cases, but it has brought to the fore certain police practices. And I think it's not just the last year that we need to focus our attention on, because there really is quite an alarming prevalence and depressing predictability around the unprovoked, unjustified levels of violence that the police sometimes use towards peaceful protesters. And I think it's important to remember that the framework around the protection of the right of assembly is not just peaceful assembly, which is at its core, but is also deliberately disruptive assemblies, spontaneous assemblies, and the protection from this absolute right against torture and ill-human or degrading treatment extends also to assemblies that are no longer peaceful. So in terms of the impact of this kind of police intervention, it clearly has a direct effect on those individuals targeted and a chilling effect on others. And it's really vital that the normative framework that we're using and extending it beyond the right to life fully captures the harms that people experience and also expands the possibilities for obtaining some kind of accountability.
Kerry, can I bring you in? I mean, it's not, we have to also be honest, it's not just in the last year that it has been suggested that sometimes police are heavy-handed when, dealing with demonstrations. You look specifically at issues of police violence against people of African descent. And I'm wondering have you noticed more uneven treatment over the last year? I mean, I personally was quite surprised last week in the UK to see a demonstration of women protesting against violence against women in the streets being broken up. It looked like, on the TV anyway, quite aggressively. And then a couple of days later, a demonstration against COVID restrictions just going ahead. I mean, have you perceived a kind of bias that perhaps we knew was there already being exacerbated in the last year?
Okay, so I don't want to talk too much about police violence against demonstrations, people engaged in demonstrations, but certainly I do think that it's been exacerbated over the past year, and because of COVID, but also just because the demonstrations have become so large, especially in the United States. And I just think that the police and even some politicians are really angered by this. And so I think the response has become even more excessive. Sure.
Sina, this is because we're doing the rounds. You've been very patient. I know that you have experience of, I mean, we're not only going to talk about demonstrations, let me assure the audience of that, but I know that you have that experience in Kenya. So perhaps you could share perhaps some of your concerns and what you see as the key issues there.
Thank you, Imogen, and thank you for IMCT for inviting ICJ Kenya and the distinguished panelists. For ICJ Kenya, who've been monitoring the scope of police brutality, particularly in the context of COVID pandemic enforcement measures, our own analysis, including those of our partners, is that it is actually a systemic issue that has just been more pronounced and more enhanced. Just today, we launched a report, what we have called, we've called it Punishing Pandemic, that ICJ Kenya and another number of civil society organizations in Kenya under the coalition, Missing Voices Coalition, have demonstrated that police brutality that has resulted not only in enforced disappearances, but also extrajudicial killings have actually doubled. Between May 2020 itself, police killings due to enforcement of the pandemic we had 24 persons killed. Going back to that and following our tracking of the actions within Kenya, I'll speak within Kenya because that's the context and more, we've been able to collect a lot more statistics, is that even during demonstrations of peaceful assembly or picketing, police have used force, brutal force, which have included kicking, sometimes using, tear gas to disperse peaceful assemblies, all in the name of enforcing this COVID pandemic guideline regulations. So yes, that would, in our view, it is a systemic issue, but has only been exacerbated by the COVID pandemic situation. Thank you, Imogen.
Niels, I'm going to put some of those points to you first, but then really any of you could come in. What Elsie mentioned there, the statistics, are really, really quite shocking. And we do know that we have seen police acting perhaps more vigorously, would be a diplomatic way to put it, in the last year. But nevertheless, we don't have any law enforcement people here on the panel. I would put it to you, is it going to be hard to talk to law enforcement people about the fact that torture, that word, is something they should be considering, that some of the ways in which they operate may constitute that? I mean, how are you going to start that dialogue?
Well, I certainly try to start a dialogue by addressing states at the General Assembly and actually explaining to them that that is the legal framework, and that's not me coming up with it. I mean, my predecessors have said that. It has been confirmed in various human rights courts and similar implementation mechanisms. It's just not reached kind of a mainstream awareness. And so my thematic report certainly is what I can do from the perspective of my mandate to kind of try to mainstream that. But it is very important, I think, that also civil society takes this up, that we have more cases where we're complaining about police brutality, not just as police brutality, but that it is a form of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. Torture, I think, is an extreme form. I think we should be aware where the person has to be powerless. So almost already overpowered, not necessarily in physical custody. They can be in a closed confinement and then they're using tear gas inside that room and people cannot move. But it implies an elevated level of control over this and defenselessness on the part of the victim. But also we should not forget that cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, it does not amount to torture, is just as serious a violation, is just as absolutely prohibited. And yes, certainly it is difficult, but I think it is very important we do that, because what we've seen, I think, over, and it was right, it's not just the last year, but over the last 20 years, I believe, we've seen a development where police have been militarized throughout the world. If you just look at the uniforms they're wearing, I remember when I was a teenager in Switzerland, police officers would always wear blue uniforms and they would never walk around in camouflage or in kind of these black, fatigues that makes them look like terrorists more than like law enforcement officers. And it seems that, and I'm closing here, but I think it's a very important point that I have the impression, and that's at the root of how, a root cause of the problem, how police officers identify themselves, and not as serving the people, but they're looking at the people increasingly as a potential threat and a potential enemy. And that, I think, is very, very problematic and needs to be corrected.
Who wants to come in there? I did see Rahini nodding, and I think Kerry as well. Put your hand up, whichever. Kerry, on you go.
Yeah, I concur with everything that Nils said, and it's absolutely true in the United States. We see the police wearing, you know, that like they show up for the simplest things in riot gear, and they're just even when they're patrolling, they have tasers and they use them on people for any reason whatsoever. I think he characterized it so very well that the community is viewed as a threat. Like they don't behave as if they're there to actually protect and serve the community. They want to control and manage the community, and they're willing to harm them if they believe that it's necessary.
Is there any validity in suggesting that also the community, I mean, there's a chicken and egg, the community views the law enforcement as a threat? I mean, I'm not justifying any of the behavior we're discussing here. What I would say, just having witnessed a little bit of it over the last year, is that for a police officer who does want to serve the community, it can't have been much fun over the last 12 months to basically be telling people, particularly young people, just not to enjoy themselves. Go home, don't stand so close together. There's too many of you sitting on this park bench, go home. This is maybe a little bit far from our topic. It's just, I do wonder whether, because we don't have any law enforcement officials here, is there also a mentality among some sections of the community as well, that we're too far divided? Kerry, I will come back to you in a moment, but Rahini, I think, did want to come in there.
I think that's really interesting. I would say, I don't know. I mean, I don't think we can generalize these crowds. Obviously, like, different countries are very, very different. And even within countries or even cities, like when you have a crowd of, you know, even a couple hundred people, that means you have a couple hundred opinions, and a couple thousand or tens of thousands means tens of thousands of opinions and views that are all very nuanced. But I will say, like most populations, most communities are interacting with police day to day on that smaller stuff. And most of it is not that worrying in the small scale that you're describing, like the park bench or something. When it does come into play is exactly how Neil said, when the police are like othering the community, and that they don't feel an integral part of it. So yesterday, this might be relevant, but yesterday in California, where I live, there was a bill proposed to help regulate the use of crowd control weapons in the state assembly. And they've been working on that bill for over 2 years. And even the police chiefs union kind of agreed to it, because the way we work with police is not necessarily to start with what we already know about the othering and the militarization, but to start really with the low-hanging fruit and the very simple, like, practical approaches. For instance, tear gas can often be dangerous to police officers as well. Like, nobody enjoys getting that gas in their face. And when you speak practically about the fact that in the vast majority of crowds, even when there's violence, even when there's parts of the crowd that, you know, are stirring things up, the vast majority is pretty peaceful. We can start with, like, basic parts of laws that talk about regulation of the use, or maybe monitoring, documenting incidents of use of force and violence. Like, even those simple things that have nothing to do with banning weapons are still tend to be really hard work and sometimes controversial. And And so I think when you talk about working with police, I think, just very concretely and in those practical issues has been the only way we've really achieved any success. And that's just in the last few months after years of work.
Kerry, I know you had your hand up earlier, so go ahead.
You asked the question whether the community views the police as a threat. Well, speaking for the United States, some communities do view the police as a threat, and they do so with good reason, because the police is really antagonistic in their communities. And just, to throw out a couple of numbers, in 2020, police killed 1,127 people, and about 30% of the people killed were people of African descent, even though people of African descent only make up about 13% of the population. So yes, I would say yes, people do view the police as a threat, and with good reason.
When we talk about how the community views the police, or how the police view the community, it was put earlier that they start to view the community as kind of an enemy. But there's another factor in this equation, isn't there, really? And that is the political leaders, the governments, because law enforcement are public servants. And if they behave in a certain way, I mean, we see it, don't we? Michael Hamilton and Elsie, I perhaps like to bring you in here from different perspectives, but governments do use law enforcement for their own ends. It's not just about keeping the peace, it's their version of the peace. Michael, do you want to?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And we were talking earlier about how this kind of treatment of protesters has become routine and systematic, not merely exceptional. And that applies not only in kind of authoritarian or hybrid regimes, but in countries in the West, countries that profess to have democratic values. And I think the premise of your question, Imogen, is absolutely right, that leaders do sometimes use the police for their own political ends. We saw the former president in the US calling for the police to dominate the streets and to establish an overwhelming law enforcement presence. I don't want to aggrandize his words by quoting him, but there is a real issue at the heart of that. And to go back to the previous question, the police are undoubtedly in a difficult position. I agree absolutely with everything Kerry has said about, the communities rightly treating police as a threat because of police antagonism. And this is a mutually reinforcing cycle. I suppose what I would say is that we've seen in the last number of years a proliferation of standards that have built on some of the core documents, the UN Basic Principles and the Use of Force, the UN Code of Conduct for Law Enforcement Officials, which themselves set out very clear guidance on how police should deal with demonstrators. And as Neil said, we've seen also the militarization of policing, but we've also then seen the use and the acquisition by the police of what are called less lethal weapons. And the danger is that the same police culture, the same institutional cultures are now using these newly acquired weapons, and they're using these weapons in ways that are inappropriate and that cause significant harms as a result. So, there are a range of things that have happened alongside the proliferation of international standards that we might have hoped would have seen a reduction in this kind of policing.
Elsie, can I bring you in? We've ranged over a variety of topics, but what I wanted to ask you specifically is, is there that sense, as we've heard from some of the other panelists, that it very much is a kind of us and them?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Imogen. In our context, police, as Kerry rightly put, are actually viewed with suspicion. And even when they are used by politicians or, the state to enforce regulations, whether it is during for example, the electioneering period, or if we are looking at the COVID enforcement of the COVID pandemic regulations, the relationship and the tension is heightened. Just to give you an example, and it is one of the cases we actually shared with the Committee Against Torture last July, is the outrage of the community where two police officers were actually torched by members of the public because they were angry that the police officers were enforcing the guidelines on, on prevention of the COVID pandemic, but the use of force was so excessive to the extent that resulted in a death of a disabled shoemaker who was only trying to earn a living, who allegedly had not put on a mask. So that just heightened the tension in that particular community. And even bringing back to, your question around use of the politicians or use of enforcement, law enforcement to advance their own ends. In Kenya, we witnessed that a lot during the electioneering period, where election violence is actually documented and witnessed. Gender-based violence is on the increase. You'll find police using the same force, the same tactics that they deploy in terms of either crowd control or, brutally, beating up, in election campaign periods, documented, particularly in informal settlements where, candidates or, members of the public want to participate in political activities. But the question is, in terms of accountability, when these concerns are raised with, say, specific authorities that are mandated, for example, in Kenya, the Police Oversight Authority, or even with the Director of Public Prosecutions, or with the Director of Criminal Investigations themselves, the system, the weaknesses in investigation and prosecution of some of the complaints, not just raised with the authority, the Police Oversight Authority, but also within the prosecution service. So it is a whole chain of systemic weaknesses that heightens that tension and suspicion between the members of the public and police that clearly demonstrate some of the actions amount to either cruel, degrading treatment or torture. Thank you, Imogen.
Thank you very much. That's really interesting. In fact, we're having one or two comments coming in from our viewers around the world. A viewer in Bangladesh has told us on Facebook they believe police violence is just the tip of the iceberg and that the state sponsors it. I think this is, again, we get back to the idea that old, I think it's Chinese expression, that a fish rots from the head, that police can feel, if they feel licensed to behave in a particular way by the government, they will do it. Now we have some specific questions. This is really interesting, actually, directed to you, Niels, but I think other people might be interested in answering it as well. It's from Anais in Barcelona, and she says, some police weapons, such as rubber bullets, are fired at the bulk of protesters, basically indiscriminately, is what she's saying. They bounce on the ground, then they still hit people. The police allege there was no intention to injure. Where would this fit in the idea of intentionally inflicting pain if you're firing into a crowd of protesters? Niels, I'll come to you first. Yeah. I can imagine that our other panelists have a view on this too.
Thank you very much. I think it's a very interesting question, because if you look at the definition in the Convention Against Torture, even of the definition of torture, it speaks of the intentional infliction of pain or suffering, right? And mental or physical. And that obviously would also amount to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. But the intent in international law is not necessarily equivalent with a desire to cause pain and suffering. It just means that it is foreseeable that the use of force will cause pain and suffering in the natural course of events. So that is sufficient for intent to be there. And so obviously, if you use a certain type of weapon in a way that will then, become uncontrollable because you have these ricochets, or you have, these rubber bullets bounce off walls or the ground, or you fire tear gas canisters at the wrong height, then you're deliberately or consciously taking the risk, that and counting, basically expecting that it will cause these types of effects. So that would already amount to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. And there, just to remind also everybody that there is a treaty obligation to prevent through all effective means, which means legislation, but also training, instructions on how weapons can be used or cannot be used, issuing certain restrictions on how they can be used in order to prevent that their use will cause pain or suffering amounting to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. So there is no excuse really based on that argument.
Michael Hamilton, I saw you nodding. Kerry, I'd also be interested in what do you think about that?
Sí, ¿qué pensáis vosotros? Sí, estaba diciendo que sí con la cabeza, porque lo llevaría a lo que comentaba Nils antes, que esto tiene que ver con la manera en que la policía entiende su función. Y, por ejemplo, cuando hay manifestaciones, la policía muchas veces, se centra en controlar en vez de en facilitar las manifestaciones pacíficas. Y
for that practice to become so deep-rooted is our vagaries in the underlying domestic legal framework. And that certainly is something that we've seen in relation to COVID-related restrictions and the police being placed in a position where the underlying legal framework is not clear. But when it comes to, the deployment of certain kinds of weapon, that again is where the domestic legal framework can bite and regulate the way in which the police use, in terms of the question, plastic or rubber-coated metal bullets.
Unmute myself, sorry. Okay, Kerry, I wanted to ask you about that. Is this one of the things that needs to be looked at particularly closely? Is this almost like indiscriminate? It's ours, we'll use it, we need to.
Yes, absolutely. It's a big issue in the US, in a lot of major cities, and it's not a new issue. It's going back a couple of decades at least that I know about, with police using these crowd control tactics that are really harmful. There have been investigations and lawsuits in places like New York. But at the end of the day, the problem is that, even when some person wins a lawsuit and gets a certain amount of money, the city has a fund to pay for these things, right? And so the person gets some money, but nothing really happens to the police officers. So they just feel emboldened to continue acting like that. So it's definitely being talked about and looked at, but nothing ever really happens. So the issue is just impunity.
Accountability is something that you think really needs to be focused on more then?
Yes.
We've got a couple, interestingly, questions coming in from Colombia, who say, and I feel for you, what can we do if the government refuses to accept that there's a structural problem with abuse of the use of force by the police? What can we actually do about that? I mean, that's really a difficult one, isn't it? I mean, the simple answer would be change your government, mate, but it's not it's not quite as simple as that. Elsie, do you have an input there?
Yes, I thank you, Imogen. I actually share the frustration, because it's pretty much what we're experiencing, not just in Kenya, but across Eastern Africa, the situation in Uganda and Tanzania. And what we've done as ICJ, we've used a couple of interventions that could possibly, provide some sort of ideas in response to the question. We have prioritized advocacy. We know advocacy, whereas it has sometimes long-term, you need a long-term sustained strategy, but sometimes immediately, responding to, mirroring to the state that you need to rein onto the police, or that you need to do something about, the excesses and the brutality of the law enforcement. So for example, for us, we have used the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions as basic as developing prosecution guidelines on questions on, police brutality or extrajudicial killings or anything that we perceive could amount to torture as provided for in our domestic legislation. So, and then using also the criminal justice chain, bringing together the criminal justice chain, whether it's the prosecution, the investigative arm, but also the judiciary, bringing in the judiciary to sort of, look at the questions around, how quickly are they fast tracking some of the cases that are brought before them, specifically related to torture or ill and cruel and degrading treatment. Sometimes it's a systemic issue across the region, as you have very good laws, enacted legislations. We have, for example, the National Coroner's Act in Kenya, but hasn't been operationalized. So conversations with the legislature and telling them, you need to do this because if you do this, it is going to assist you to meet your international rights standards obligations. Just a few examples: advocacy, 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 and public dialogue, building a movement and a force like we've done for the Missing Voices Coalition in Kenya. I hope that, that will assist our colleagues in Colombia. Thank you very much, Imogen.
I think that's, hats off to you, because that is a long effort where you must invest a lot of time and not always be able to see an immediate solution to the issue. This is where I'm quite interested in bringing in Niels and Michael, and then a response from, maybe Kerry and Rahini first. Are the international institutions, somebody like Niels or the OSCE, for Europe, do you see them as mechanisms that can actually help, or are they too far away? I don't mean to denigrate what you do, Niels and Michael, but I'm just trying to get a feel of people, dealing with the kind of things that Elsie is talking about there, or Kerry. Do you see them as something that can really help? Rahini, we haven't heard from you for a minute, so let's bring you in.
Yeah, actually, I think this kind of links exactly with what Elsie was saying. So she mentioned bringing in like the legislature and the judiciary, and I would say in places where we've had any success, that multidisciplinary approach is exactly what's needed. I would add, as a physician, that bringing in research and public health, as well as the medical field, anywhere that I think we've had any success, like we've really been able to bring in various actors from all these different fields to work together, as well as the UN. And where I think that's really necessary is when there's just really no access to civil society, or civil society is like muted or unable to act. So I live in the US, I'm from India, where probably the use of force in custody or outside of custody is one of the worst places. And I find there's a lot of fear among the diaspora to work in India because of never having access again. And even when we are there, often it's just really hard to do that work. And so having people from the UN and having like formal relationships there really helps the movement, and helps people from civil society get access in a different way. And so that's really important. It can call attention. It's the great weaknesses of the human rights movement are that it's based on the state or the nation state, and that we have to act within that dynamic. And so really what we have from outside of the nation state system is naming and shaming, or working very closely with them to try to change the laws, like incrementally. And so any way that we can thwart that by working with the state directly can be effective.
Kelly, can I ask you then? When you're talking to people, law enforcement officers, perhaps in the United States. I mean, if you say, well, look, you know, there's a kind of a UN convention on this, or there's a UN special expert who says that's not a good idea, they say, oh, I didn't know that, I won't do it again. You need to unmute the exit.
Yeah, so of course not, right? So I am an international human rights lawyer, so I'm someone who believes in using international mechanisms to try to effect change. So I'm coming from that perspective. And you know, yes, I definitely believe that when there's international solidarity, that um, can push some governments to change their actions. I mean, you know, I think South Africa is a really good example of that. And I actually want to take this opportunity to talk about a project that I've been working on since last year. I'm a member of the steering committee that organized the International Commission of Inquiry on Systemic Racist Police Violence Against People of African Descent in the United States. And I'll give you the history of it. In June 2020, an international coalition of hundreds of organizations and individuals sent a communication to the UN Human Rights Council urging that the UN convene a commission of inquiry to investigate racism and racist police violence in the United States. The communication was sent to the UN due to the excellent organizing done by some groups in the US, such as the US Human Rights Network, and also advocacy groups such as Mothers Against Police Brutality and others. The UN declined the request to convene the Commission of Inquiry, and we found out through our contacts at the UN that the US had pushed back really hard against it and made threats to different countries not to support the proposal. So following the UN's decision to not convene the Commission of Inquiry, the National Conference of Black Lawyers, the National Lawyers Guild, and the International Association of Democratic Lawyers decided to convene a Commission of Inquiry to conduct the thorough and impartial investigation of police violence in the US that the community had demanded. The Commission of Inquiry's mandate was to investigate the systemic, widespread, and grave violations of the rights of Black people by police in the US and present its findings and recommendations in a report. So we assembled a team of 12 experts, commissioners, none of whom are from the US, to conduct the investigation in an independent and impartial manner. We conducted live hearings where the commissioners heard testimony from the family members of victims of police violence, testimony from lawyers who represent the families of victims, and testimony from community activists. The commissioners also reviewed reports, legislation, and other relevant materials. We concluded our live hearings of 44 cases last month, and we have a team of rapporteurs who've been working on a report. The report will be shared with the UN High Commissioner at the end of this month, and the High Commissioner's office, we've been meeting with them, and they say that they intend to use portions of our report in a report that the High Commissioner is working on for the Human Rights Council. And we also hope that the report will serve as a resource to the community and to people working on this issue. So yes, I absolutely think that international advocacy can help. But you know, it's part of a larger strategy, right? You know, there's the organizing that people do. There are things such as the demonstrations. There's legislation. There are lawsuits. So all of it is part of a collective struggle, I think. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much for that, and welcome to the world of the UN Human Rights Council, where not everything you think should go through does go through. However, I would say that this particular issue has attracted, and maybe that you can argue is that a good or a bad thing, but it certainly has attracted the attention of me and my colleagues in the press corps at the UN. What this is now on the UN agenda and will get some attention in the media. And perhaps that would be helpful. Niels and Michael, I wanted to bring you in then to my earlier question of, do you see really, I guess you must, a significant role for international mechanisms here, despite the fact that sometimes the UN Human Rights Council is over politicized, as we know, and doesn't go in the direction that you might like?
Yeah, maybe if I start here, I think when we look from a perspective of a democratic system, the solution is already given on the national level, in theory, because as it was mentioned, the executive there's oversight by the legislative power and by the judiciary. So if the law is really applied, we don't have a problem because torture and ill treatment is absolutely prohibited, and it even amounts to an international crime. Certainly when it's systematic and widespread, it would be a crime against humanity. I mean, there is any legal basis you would desire to have, you have already, really, to prosecute this, to prevent it, to punish it, to rehabilitate, redress, and so on. Now, it doesn't happen in practice, and we know that. But that means that we have a crisis of democracy, that there is no accountability in practice. And that is horrible, but we need to acknowledge that as being the truth. It's not a question of a few bad apples. It's not a few rotten apples, it's a rotten orchard. And so it really is a corrupted system. It's not a few bad people. You replace the people, they become corrupted again because the system is set up in a way that does not favor or does not even allow accountability in any significant measure. And that is really shocking. So now the international system comes in. And so, our mandates as special rapporteurs are as strong as they're designed to be by the international community. And the Human Rights Council the UN is not separate from the state. It's just the lowest common denominator that states can agree on. And that's not very promising, and that's exactly what happens. I just happened to have submitted my latest report to the Human Rights Council 2 weeks ago, where I analyzed all my individual communications on behalf of individual torture victims of the first 4 years of my mandate, more than 500 communications, and I statistically evaluated how many % of those communications have received a constructive response. That is to say, a response that would have allowed to at least establish the facts of what happened, or prevent the torture if it was impending, or rehabilitate the victim, or just, where was there a solution to the case? More than 90%, 90, remained unresolved. And that's over 4 years of my mandate, and it basically is consistent with the statistics of my predecessors. So that is the reality of the impact I can have. And I just intended to put a mirror in front of the international community and say, the system that you established does not work because you designed it not to work. And I think we have to be honest to ourselves about the intent of the leaders. If we allow them to exercise uncontrolled power, they will exercise uncontrolled power, and they will not do it in the public interest, but they will do it in their own interest. So we'll have to look, and I just want to, a last remark here, a little bit to expand on the democratic system. If we allow, by and large systems where our legislative representatives are funded by private companies, and their campaigns and the lobbying, is basically the most powerful influence on what pieces of legislation are being passed, we should not be surprised if in the end, the population of voters is just considered to be a nuisance. So we need accountability of the politicians, not just on paper, but in reality to the people. And for this, we also need transparency and accountability. If there is secrecy and there is spreading, it's a growing tendency to protect state secrecy, even through criminal law, then we are bound to create a system where we have legal black holes, where people and especially political leaders and business leaders, can operate without oversight and restraint. And that is bound to produce and strengthen that kind of opposition between the government and its law enforcement and the people, the othering that was mentioned very rightly, and then produce obviously also torture and ill treatment.
Michael, I'm just going to bring you in there briefly as well, because this, to me, it feels a bit like Groundhog Day. You know, this is the fatal flaw, isn't it? That international conventions, international law, they're kind of nice to have until push comes to shove, and then national governments will start tinkering with them. I mean, it's almost 20 years since I think it was George Bush, Dick Cheney, and Donald Rumsfeld were tinkering with the Geneva Conventions.
Yeah, I mean, given everything that Rohini and Kerry and Niels have said, I don't think any of us looks to the international system as a panacea, and we recognize the constraints that it operates within. And it can do some things. It can, it can set standards. It can provide, for example, legislative support, but that, of course, is often dependent on having and receiving an invitation from a state, or in the case of a country visit by a special procedure, there needs to be an invitation. And so there are constraints around what the international community can do. I would add another thing, and this links back to a comment, I think it was Niels earlier talked about training and the importance of that for, as part of the solution. There is a risk, I think, that if we focus only on training, that we will reinvent the kind of defund the police debate that there has been in the US, and that we think only of a kind of a sticking plaster approach to this. We believe that it can all be solved through training initiatives. But I think training has to be part of the solution. The other thing I think critically that must be thought about, and this is a role for civil society in places like Colombia and elsewhere where there's a clear lack of political will to make fundamental change, and that is the role that monitors can play. So civil society monitors who are observing what happens in the streets, observing the actions of the police in relation to demonstrators, and then either publishing reports or seeking to introduce their findings into court proceedings in order to hold officers and law enforcement officials accountable. I think that's a really key aspect of the work that can be done and can be supported at the international level. And I think it's also interesting because it links to the I can't remember who said earlier that elections were often the predicate for this. And if we look at Myanmar, if we look at Uganda, if we look at Belarus, all of the abuses around demonstrations in the street are happening in relation to contested elections and allegations of corruption. And there is actually quite an infrastructure in place to undertake election monitoring. So one of the things I think could happen is that infrastructure around election monitoring could be expanded in a useful way, also to look at to include monitoring of demonstrations.
So this is really interesting. So without even prompting from me, you're all moving towards what we wanted to have from this debate, which is some suggestions for solutions, remedies, and so forth. We have a couple of interventions from our audience also, and those who put in questions, I haven't forgotten you, I can see them here, but we do need to bring in Raja Baga, who's from the Police Reform Programme, Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative. And Raja, since you're there, we actually have a question here. What is the recourse or remedy in a country like India, which has signed but refuses to ratify the UN Convention Against Torture? That speaks to something we've just been discussing, really, that the kind of international conventions tend to dissolve when a country doesn't want them. Anyway, Raja, the floor is yours.
Thanks, thank you. I basically wanted to talk about how in India we've looked at extra custodial violence and police brutality. But before I do that, I just wanted to sort of acknowledge that the panelists before me, listening to Kerry, Michael, Niels, and Rohini and others, there clearly seems to be a lot of concurrence and commonality in how police practices are viewed and understood in different jurisdictions. I was specifically intrigued by the conversation around how the community perceives policing, police, and therefore the idea of fear. We in India have sort of been trying to look and understand community voices, to understand how representative they feel the police is, and how does that impact their understanding of whether the police would listen to or would work for them or not. So representation is something that we've clearly noticed, that there are only particular communities who are part of the police force, which are completely distinct from the community it serves. Just wanted to mention that. But coming back to the broader conversation around non-custodial police brutality in India, certainly, I think Radha was earlier talking about how, as far as custody is concerned, we've seen more than 1,000 deaths in police custody happening within 24 hours of arrest, and that's certainly a concern. But we've also noticed of late, and this has been a pattern for quite some time, that there's been a clear repression of dissenting voices. There's been a lot of questioning of new laws, new procedures by certain groups, be it minority groups, be it educational institutions, and there's been a clear resistance in terms of both a detention as well as use of tear gases. We've seen pellet guns in Kashmir, and beatings and batons being used. And those relate to three things. Relate to multiple things, but three things that clearly something that we sort of look at. One is lack of weak legislative frameworks. Clearly, so while India has not ratified UNCAT, but at the same time, there's no legislation. There's no national legislation. Even in the absence of that, the existing provisions allow for sanctions for police officers, which basically mean that it becomes difficult to prosecute them. There are also structural issues with respect to oversight mechanisms that either do not have enough infrastructure or the will to be able to prosecute or even question the human rights abuses by the police. And third is also political patronage, is something that we've seen very often affecting how policing is understood. So the culture of impunity, because the political elite allows policing to be functioning in a particular way. And while these three, bringing it together, impact everyday policing, we've seen how it has exacerbated in non-regular settings. For example, during COVID, we looked at how policing was. In the absence of these frameworks, the amount of violence, the amount of beating, and not just physical force, but abuses, but insults, but frog jumps, multiple ways to denigrate people for offending and violating violating lockdown rules, was something that was quite visible. The other reality of India, which is about communal violence, that is unfortunately a reality. We've also noticed how policing, there's been a lot of evidence to show complicity of the police in defending a particular community and attacking or at least complicit in helping the other. And so all of these, while can be understood as instances, but it is clearly a response to a clear lack of both legal, structural, and political will to be able to balance that. In terms of COVID, for example, the amount of brutality that we saw from the police on an everyday basis, not only was that normalized, but also communities were pitted against each other in the hope of fear. We've actually, we can also share the link of the report that we've prepared around the policing during the pandemic in India, that might be useful for others to view. But yeah, basically that was my intervention for now. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Raja. In fact, some of the points that you make there are reflected in some of the questions also that we're getting. For example, we have one from Venezuela who talks about the police being basically used as the enforcement arm of the government. The use by police forces also of groups of private armed groups to do the things they don't quite want seem to be doing. We have Montse Fenosa from Spain. What about police unions who protect their members? We touch on the ability of the issue of accountability there. And again, another one from Colombia, the government refuses to accept that there's a structural problem. And you've got a whole picture of a systemic problem there. Who wants to come in? I did see, Rohini, you were certainly looking like you were interested.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting place for some positive thinking. There's I think there's real opportunity now to do more work. First of all, the fact that we're convening a panel with the torture committee on the extracustodial use of force is it's just a testimony to how important this has become. I would say, the first report that we wrote on crowd control weapons was, I don't know, in the 1980s or something, about Korea. And the most recent report the big report we wrote was in 2015 or 2016. And all of that work is really important because it showed the weaknesses in the system, that the data was there. And then when, in the US at least, when protests started happening after the police killed George Floyd in May of last year, that work really became more important. And we were able to create all over the US, there's ongoing legislation being designed, being formed. And that shows that like all of this work, I think, is important to do in the background because there's opportunities that come. I would also say another big opportunity I see is that because of social media and cell phones and new technologies, there's much more opportunities now to have kind of real-time reporting on incidents of injuries, of violence, of human rights abuses. And that is something that we in the human rights community really need to leverage and harness, because we're able to identify these incidents of violence much faster and call attention to them. And that's something we can really use. I saw someone in the post said, the violence is increasing. As an epidemiologist, I would say, I don't know that the violence is increasing. There's been violence for hundreds of years by police on communities. And as Raja said, especially on, vulnerable communities that are typically also repressed, and in the US and India, anywhere. But what we do have now is much better reporting that happens like almost in the moment. And so when we can harness that, I think that's a real opportunity to do better documentation, better accountability, and really show what the problem is and then work on it faster.
Kerry, Elsie, I'd like to put that point to you. Is the fact that, an incidence of police brutality, as with George Floyd, can be recorded on a smartphone and put around the world, is that going to be a check and balance on law enforcement? Do you see that? And it occurred to me also when I saw that, and we all found it really, really shocking, but surely I would like to think that even though we have this othering, even though we have this us and them, that most people, wearing a uniform or not, don't actually want to be responsible for something like that. It's not just that they don't want to be seen to be responsible for it, but that they don't want to be. I mean, is there an appeal to the better nature of law enforcement? Say, look, there are ways and ways of doing this. Kerry, do you want to come in first, or Elsie, whichever of
you? Okay, so I'm going to respond to the last part. I don't believe that there are just a few bad apples. I think that there are systemic problems, and in the United States and in other places, but I'll focus on the US. um, it's just a very toxic and corrupt system. And I don't think you can appeal to someone's supposedly good nature. There's very, very deep systemic issues with policing in the US that are historical. Um, yeah, so I can't agree with you on that. I have to tell you that. Um, Now, if we want to would you like me to talk about potential solutions right now?
Yeah, I would be interested in yes, this is the section of the debate we're moving on to. So yes, and then I'll come to Elsie.
Okay, well, all right. Within the US and in progressive circles, there are people pushing for defunding the police. And, people that say that it's because they're aware of and they look at the historical roots of policing in the United States. Um, and yeah, perhaps I should say a few things about that. So in the US, there is a historical backdrop to racist policing. In the US South, for example, some of the first policing institutions were slave patrols, which would track and chase enslaved people who had escaped. Those were some of the first policing institutions in the United States. And the slave patrols were also supposed to prevent slaves from organizing revolts. So after the end of slavery, local law enforcement behaved in the same way the slave patrols did, enforcing segregation and restricting the freedom of the no longer enslaved Black people. US laws and policies such as the Black Codes or Jim Crow laws were written after the end of slavery to control, segregate, and oppress Black people. And these were actual laws that existed for decades. The police and even ordinary citizens, white people, they enforced those laws with violence. The Jim Crow laws were finally eradicated with the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1965. But those deeply entrenched attitudes and practices persist to today. So this is what I mean when I say that it's systemic and it's historic and it's, and this is why some people believe that you just have to dismantle policing as it exists, and to have something new. Um, so I want to mention that recently this police reform package was passed by the U.S. House of Representatives, which included the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. So it still needs to be passed by the Senate, so it's not a done deal. So I want to say about that law that it has some good portions, like it would ban qualified immunity, which is huge, and it aims to create some national standards for policing, and that might also help with accountability. But it's also received a lot of criticism from community groups because it focuses on reactive measures and incrementalist reforms, right? And so the law, for example, it's saying that it wants to ban chokeholds, but the fact is that chokeholds are already banned in some cities, but the police still use them, even though they're banned. So this law wouldn't solve that problem. Now, there is this other piece of legislation that's really progressive called the Breathe Act. It was proposed last July, and it's trying to address the fundamental causes of police violence. It would transform the criminal legal system in the US with significant changes, such as eliminating the Drug Enforcement Administration and the use of surveillance technology, abolishing mandatory minimum sentences, and ending life sentences. It would also redirect funding toward communities to address the nation's systemic racial injustice. So, at this point, it was proposed and it has a few supporters, but the Breathe Act is not really moving yet because, as you can imagine, the police and and many politicians are opposed to it. But I think that would be one really good solution to policing in the US, to racist policing.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I mean, it's a fairly pessimistic view specific to the United States, although obviously some of the issues you raise are not unique to the United States at all. Elsie, I want to bring you in as well, because we are really looking at the solutions now. Now, Kerry did talk about legal remedies. We have a comment from Tracy in the UK who said, she says, she thinks there's a risk in putting too much faith in legal routes alone. There needs to be a strong group of people in every country who are just stand up to oppose torture, police brutality, and will be prepared to stand up and mobilize against it and demand accountability. I sense from some of the things you have said earlier that this is kind of precisely the route some of you and your colleagues are taking. It's not just the law. It's like, we know what the law is and we're prepared to stand up for it.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Imogen. I'll write on Michael's earlier comment around how else to civil society, other than doing research and documenting how to build coalitions and build a movement that actually of human rights defenders that actually stand up and speak up against torture or police brutality, or actions that amount to cruel and degrading treatment. In Kenya, from the report of the Missing Voices Coalition, what we've done in terms of the approach, other than mobilizing civil society around a thematic issue on police brutality, is using, as Michael rightly put, community monitors. In the report, you'll find that a lot of the extrajudicial killings and enforced disappearances happen in major cities like Nairobi or in Mombasa. So based on that, the civil society are realizing that they need to cascade that and get more community monitors to give us reports that could be verified, and then they are published and use that information for advocacy. So cascading that to the very local, very community level to collect and document the police brutality incidences. So that would be one practical solution that has worked. And when we launched the report today, no government likes to hear that this is really the face of their brutality. Actually, we've titled the report "The Brutal Pandemic," just to emphasize that, it is not the pandemic merely demonstrated that, the systemic problems that Kerry is talking about. It has just spotlighted that there is a problem and you need to address it. So having the human rights defenders stand up and use community monitors to document, I think, is really a practical way that has worked for us here in Kenya. In addition to litigation, we continue to follow the cases of police brutality in the court systems. Whereas the court system slowed down because of the pandemic situation, we've, as jurists and civil society working in the legal sector, we still are convinced that part of the accountability is to have redresses mechanisms and reparations within the court systems. And with that pronunciations on the state obligations, then there's a chance to increase dialogue between the policymakers and the legislatures, either around issues of legislation or gaps around, compensation and reparations for victims of human rights violations, for example. And quickly, just before I hand over to you, Imogen, I wanted to just pick on Kerry's, just to respond to Kerry's concern and your question around, does spotlighting the police, on social media, does it have the effect? Yes, whereas it's systemic, for us in Kenya, it's actually worked to force the state to respond to the issues that are affecting the citizenry. An incident also that I'd like to highlight that we actually brought to the attention of the Committee Against Torture again last year was a situation where a law enforcement official dragged a woman in a motorbike all the way to the police station. That was captured on video. And when that was shared on social media, it caused outrage. And that actually evoked a response to prosecute and investigate that particular police officer because of the brutality and just the cruel treatment of a woman who was allegedly accused of stealing stealing a cooking gas. And then that also resulted in the president giving a directive that the police inspector general must list, name and shame police officers who are actually accused of, either actions that amount to torture or cruel treatment. So that could be a way that we've used as civil society actors to also push back and say we need to know these individual police officers that are brutalizing communities or actually meting these cruel and degrading treatments to members of the public. So thank you, Imogen.
Okay, thank you very much, Elsie. As I told the organisers of this panel, you think an hour and a half is long, but it isn't when you look at a subject like this. We are still, though, we're moving towards the end, but we're still on the solutions and remedies. There's another one which has been touched on, and that is to do with what kind of kits the police are allowed to have and how they are allowed to use it. We have an intervention I'd like to bring in, but we also have some comments from our viewers. Fernando Chile points out that the police in Chile do have rubber bullets. They are allowed to use them, but they have been used in a way which has actually resulted in the loss of sight, one or both eyes, hundreds of protesters, and that the response was the use is in line with police protocols. So on that note, before I move to closing remarks from all of you, I'd like to bring in Matthew McAvoy of the Omega Foundation to talk a little bit about crowd control equipment, weapons, their use, and how much say we should have over them. The floor is yours, Matthew.
Thank you very much, Imogen. Hi, everyone. Thanks to OMCT as well for organising what has been a very, very interesting discussion. It's been fascinating so far. I think the question links very well with many of the interventions that have been made so far. It follows directly on from what Elsie has just said. And also, I think it links back to what a couple of the panelists said about the militarization of police. And this is something that we've documented in the Omega Research Foundation. We've got data systems with over 20,000 companies around the world, many of whom are manufacturing or trading in some of the types of weapons that we've discussed today, and also many others, unfortunately. And this industry has grown exponentially, and it's taken some time for the international human rights system to catch up, I think. And there have been a lack of really detailed guidelines on how these instruments should be used. And I wanted to just promote one of the recent efforts to address this gap, and that is the UN guidance on less lethal weapons in law enforcement. I think it's still not widely known because it was just adopted last year by the Office of the High Commissioner. Of course, it's a technical document, and it just forms part of wider discussions around things like what is law enforcement for, what do we need to do to address problematic policing cultures and other things that have been mentioned. But I think these technical details are important. And going back to what Elsie said about strategies, about human rights monitors and civil society being able to effectively monitoring what's happening using the criminal justice system, and we need to really to know in more detail about these technical details. And of course, the use of less lethal weapons and the use of force in general, while they're not intended to cause death, they often do, but they do generally entail the infliction of pain and suffering. And that takes us right back to the definition of torture. And the UN guidance on less lethal weapons helps to make that link between the unlawful use of force and torture and other forms of ill treatment, because it says what might constitute the lawful use of, for example, kinetic impact projectiles or rubber bullets, and what would be the unlawful use. So that straight away provides us with tools. It tells us what we need to advocate to be included in laws and policies on the use of force, and how we need to litigate these cases. And just to provide, I can't present the instrument in detail, of course, But just to provide a quick example, and going back to the same type of force, which you said Fernando from Chile mentioned, and I think we're all familiar with the Chilean example and the horrific injuries that were caused there. The UN guidance says that kinetic impact projectiles must be accurate enough to hit within 10 centimeters of the point of aim from the designated range. And ammunition containing multiple projectiles, like that used in Chile, cannot meet that standard. They're inherently inaccurate and they shouldn't be used. But of course, standards like that are nothing without domestic implementation. And that's where the strategies that others have mentioned are so important. And just to finish by saying, making this link between the unlawful use of force and torture and other ill treatment is a very important strategy when it comes to effectively using the criminal justice system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. That's, I mean, a really interesting point. You know, you can't have a weapon, a crowd control weapon that's designed to do this, as in Chile, if it's not actually capable of doing it. Panelists, I'm going to ask you all now basically for a short summing up takeaway from this discussion. I mean, for myself, I'm going to say, obviously, a discussion like this could go on. It's too short. We don't have a list of these are our bullet points. This is what we can do, and it will all work. It's complicated. It's going to be my takeaway from it. But Rohini, can I come to you first? Because also I think specifically some of the things Matthew was talking about are relevant to your area of expertise. So is this an area where you think we could have a dialogue about methods of crowd control? Think about the kind of consequences if you choose the wrong method or if you use your particular method wrongly.
Yeah, I mean, I think Matthew said it best, but I would say there's two issues here. There's around speaking about crowd control or just generally the practicalities of how police act in these situations. And then there's the very related, but a little bit distinct issue of the weapons that they're permitted to carry and allowed to have and use. And embedded in all of that is the context that they're in. What I would say is, well, if I'm wrapping up, I would say that I want to make a few points to end in. One is that the crowd control weapons that we're talking about, they're integrated into the policing system. Two is that, so you can't really distinguish between the two, but if there's potential for, like banning certain weapons won't improve the system by itself. That's not the panacea. Two is that this is a global problem. From everything I'm seeing in the chat box and the questions and what we study, I think one of the reasons this is at a critical phase is because on every continent, in every country, we're seeing the use of crowd control weapons and bad policing happening on almost a daily level. And maybe it's hit fever pitch because we notice it now. And that presents a real opportunity for us to work on it on the global stage. Three is that policing and the use of crowd control weapons are embedded in structures of power and discrimination, and that we can't distinguish that this is policing without understanding the racial dimensions, the power dimensions, the religious, whatever discrimination dimensions that it's in. And I guess finally, four, that there's a lot of opportunity because there's very little done already. Like even before we get to a stage where we're asking for, banning the use of kinetic impact projectiles, which I would strongly advise to say we should do. Everything from training to manufacture to testing, to trade around these weapons, to different regimes, to surveillance and accountability for them. Like every single one of those steps has weaknesses and isn't done yet. And so this field is wide open for opportunity for work, advocacy, research, and legislation. That's it. Thank you.
No. That's very good. Michael, you're in the hot seat now. Do you go along with what Rohini has said there, or your takeaway anyway?
Yeah, she's stolen all my thunder. So that was a very good summation, and I think there's a real risk, and many of us want this conversation to continue. It's vital that it does. I think on the panel there's agreement too that this is a systemic issue, and there's a risk that we come away from a conversation like this recognizing that it involves histories of policing, that it involves institutional cultures, that it involves what Matthew's just been talking about, the commercial interests of weapons manufacturers, and we all go away despondent and resigned to think, well, nothing can change. And that goes back, Imogen, to your question of how you kind of catalyze this conversation and try and bring it about at the domestic level. At one level, there's no doubt that there will be within the police certain senior officers who have self-interest, strategic concerns around reputation of the police, and will want to take some steps that may improve the optics of protest policing. I think many of us would be skeptical of that and don't think that would go far enough. And I also think on the panel, we're all believers in the right of peaceful assembly. And so we all also hope that the kind of mobilization in the streets to force this conversation will be taken up and will be pushed forward as well, perhaps especially once lockdown measures start to lift. I'm going to end just with one point that takes me back to the role of civil society and the monitoring role, because we are faced with the challenge of how we harness all of the information that is gathered, and this is something that applies to journalism as well. I think there's a real need to have a focus on how the police enable journalists and monitors to undertake their work. And that's something we've maybe not talked about sufficiently, but too often what happens in demonstrations is that those who are trying to undertake this kind of watchdog role end up being treated by the police as participants themselves, or end up being blocked from having the kind of access that's needed to bring the visibility that we need. And I think that's a really crucial area where we can start to take incremental steps, yes, but to ensure that the police recognize their obligation to distinguish between those who are performing that role and those who are peaceful participants in demonstrations. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to second that, because as a journalist, the only place that I've actually had to run to get out of the way of rubber bullets is right here in Switzerland, doing my job on the street in Bern. Quite, you wouldn't think of it's true. Kerry, I want to have your takeaway, because we heard from both Rohini and Michael that there is really a need for dialogue, a tight need for conversation. But some of the things you have said over the past hour and a half, that I think you were very much more on the emphasis of legal remedies, and that there's maybe the time for conversation is over.
No, I wouldn't say that the time for conversation is over. I guess my point really was that I don't think that we're going to make any strides by just trying to appeal to a person's better nature. That was really my point. But I'm still interested in dialogue. And just in closing, very quickly, I want to thank the OMCT for organizing this important conversation. And it was really good hearing from everyone on the panel and from the people, the attendees. Their questions and comments were excellent. And I think that framing police violence as potentially being torture, or at the very least cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment is important for our advocacy. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Elsie, I'm going to come to you, and then Niels, as the Special Rapporteur in Georgia, will have the final word. But You, of all the panelists, you seem to be that in some ways you found methods of holding law enforcement to account. So what would you say is words of motivation, perhaps, before you leave, to Kerry and Rahimi, for example?
Thank you. I think our motivation is really the victims. You know, we've been working with what we've come to realize is the face of a victim who experiences police brutality and doesn't know how to seek justice. So that is our motivation. How else do we speak on behalf of the voiceless? So the agency that we find ourselves through the mandate, not just as ICJ Kenya, but also civil society that are pushing towards what we have termed as the Missing Voices Coalition. So our motivation is as a quest for justice for the victims. And that would be my takeaway. Whereas the systemic, whereas we recognize systemic problems, there is legislation, there are mechanisms towards holding police accountable. Vigilance, vigilance, vigilance. That is all I could say. Thank you, Imogen.
Thank you very much, Elsie. Niels, you're the Special Rapporteur on torture. Perhaps we could have a little summing up from you to the point that, you know, torture is not systemic in society. Well, maybe it is, maybe you'd say that. But what we seem to have heard today is that abusive policing, if we put it like that, does seem to be systemic in many, many countries, many societies. What would your next step be, having heard what we've heard today?
Thank you again. And obviously, it's difficult to sum up, but I would say that cruelty, in a broad sense, is systemic and is structural throughout the world and throughout all contexts. I mean, you can, whether you look at domestic violence, which creates more victims than all wars taken together every year. And that's where we grow up, in those four walls, where we're confronted with cruelty. And then how do we expect societies to function without cruelty, involving obviously torture and ill treatment and all these police violence and so on, when many millions of us grow up in violent households where there is no protection against these types of abuse. And so I would say that while the face of torture changes in various contexts, it is extremely widespread. And I don't think there is any country where it doesn't happen or where there is sufficient protection against it. And so there is no way around accountability. You've mentioned George Floyd, we can mention Abu Ghraib. These are two contexts where accountability on the individual level has happened or is likely to happen in the George Floyd case, because we have this very, stunning evidence and shocking evidence. But in both cases, certainly in Abu Ghraib, and I can assure you it will happen also in the George Floyd case, it will be this narrative of the bad apples, the few bad apples that will basically be pushed forward. And in both cases, that is absolutely not corresponding to the truth. And I know it's for a fact that in the Abu Ghraib issue was not a bad apples issue, but it was really the fruit of a rotten tree. But what do you expect if then you have a country like the US not prosecuting any war crimes, not prosecuting the CIA torture, despite the Senate committee report of 7,000 pages? Then you see the UK copying it. They do the same, right? They have their parliament confirming that there has been, a broad involvement of the UK in the CIA torture and rendition program, and there is no judicial inquiry happening, although there is an absolute legal obligation to do it. So basically, legally speaking, those political leaders become complicit in war crimes, but nothing happens. The aggression, against Iraq, nothing happens. So what do we expect to come out of this? If we accept basically impunity for criminals in uniform, then we can't be surprised if the population starts looking at people in uniform as enemies and vice versa. And so we really need, for the sanity of our societies, we need to enforce the law. We need to hold war criminals. We can't identify with war criminals just because they have our nationality. Because these people come back and become law enforcement officers. These two cultures influence each other. It's a vicious cycle. And as you said, it also influences then the response from the population becomes more violent and so on. And we have this ongoing vicious cycle. So accountability, there's no way around it. But I also feel that we can only have that if we can reestablish the identity and the purpose of law enforcement officers as serving all of society. And that is in our hands, at least in formally democratic societies. We can take individually and collectively this political responsibility. We can decide who becomes our government and who represents us in parliament, and whether they can take money from corporations and other interest groups or not, and whether we want to hold them to account or force our governments to conduct judicial inquiries and hold our own war criminals and police brutality, to account. And this is up to us. We are not powerless. The state power is ours. We delegate it to the authorities. And if we allow them to abuse it and to claim impunity for themselves, it's our fault, ultimately. So we really have to get organized, and that's obviously within the democratic processes, but that's where the ultimate power is. And I've even seen it happen in dictatorships in my previous life, in war areas for the Red Cross, that in Yugoslavia at the time when Milosevic was ousted from office, at some point people were fed up. And it took less than 10 days with no violence, essentially, no substantial violence, to oust him. So I just want to encourage people to become aware of the political responsibility and power they have. If we organize, if we inform the public, not just a dialogue with the authorities, yes, that's important, but also with society at large, journalists. There's no coincidence that they're being attacked. It's not because they're being confused as protesters, but because they're reporting and because their reports will lead to accountability. So they're seen as enemies as well, because the truth and the accountability as such is being opposed increasingly. So I think we are at a very important time in history where I would call it, and I don't think it's an exaggeration to say it's a crisis of democracy, but I think all is not lost. On the contrary, it should make us aware of the importance of democracy and of collective ownership of the state and the public institutions, including law enforcement services. And so I'm convinced if we can increase awareness in populations worldwide about this and their political ownership of this, then we can turn this ship around. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm really pleased that we ended on a fairly optimistic and motivational note, because I agree with you. I think we are at a kind of pivotal point. I've been a journalist for 30 years. I have never seen my profession so vilified as it is now. I was shocked last year to see in an ICRC report that in Western democracies, people are starting to think that on some occasions torture is justified. Our fundamental norms and standards seem to be shifting in a way that is concerning. And that's why it's been so good to talk to all of you here today, and thanks to the OMCT for organizing this. We could have gone on all day. I think it's a fascinating subject. We won't solve it, of course, today, but what I hope we have done is promoted a really healthy, informed debate, which we can all take out of this virtual room to our friends and families and colleagues, and start saying, what do you think about that? What do you think about the way the police did that? And have a proper informed discussion about it. On that note, I must thank all of the brilliant panelists, because you were amazing, and I do appreciate how awkward it can be not to all sit around a table as we used to do a year ago. and in different time zones too, Rahini and Kerry. So thank you very much. And thanks again to OMCT for organising this. I'm advised that participants to this current week against torture, you can join the virtual networking cafe right now if you want to. I'm not quite sure how you do it, but I think it could be somewhere on your screen. On that note, thank you very much, and I wish you a good rest of the day.